Well, good morning, everyone. This is Adam Weinberg here with the Platt Institute. We are now on our Facebook as well as our YouTube and discussing today's Platt Institute webinar, COVID-19 in Nebraska's economy. And thank you for sticking with us. We know you have a lot of choices with programs as we discuss the impact of COVID-19 on Nebraska's economy. And we are grateful to have joining with us today Ernie Goss, PhD, Creighton University professor, who is also with Scott Strain, Goss and Associate Senior Economist, the co-authors of a new Platt Institute discussion and policy study that you can find now on COVID-19's economic impact, which you can find right now online at plattinstitute.org/policy. We'd welcome your thoughts on that. Ernie, I have you and Scott now here on the program to join us. I'd like for you, as we start today's discussion, to lay out kind of what the assumptions and what the data that you're looking at here, how it's all laid out so that we can understand the long-term ramifications. Certainly we're going to be updating it as we go through the process of the COVID-19 impact. As well, folks, I'd like to let you know throughout today's discussion, we'd really like to take your questions. There's a Q&A option here that you can all access to send me questions. You've also sent me some great questions through email, and we would continue to be glad to have those throughout the discussion. We're expecting to have about an hour with our speakers. Ernie, why don't you and Scott each say a few words as we get started about what this new report entails?
Okay, well, thanks, Adam, and thanks to Sarah Curry as well, and thanks to the Platt Institute for engaging us. And I tell you, it's for an economist, this has probably been the biggest economic laboratory that's ever been that we faced since Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776, which of course is the fundamental outline of the free market system we're talking about. And no surprise to everyone that we're talking about in terms of the COVID-19. The COVID-19 came to Nebraska later than it did for the U.S. Now, later meaning 2 weeks. We're talking about times here of weeks, 2 weeks, not months, not years, as we economists normally do. And right now, you see on this first slide, you see that the rate, this is the infection rate that we're bringing up here on the slide. And as you see, it's almost 4 times the rate. The U.S. rate's almost, this is per million residents, and as you see, it's about 5 times higher for the U.S. than for Nebraska. But unfortunately for Nebraska, Nebraska's catching up quickly. And if you're talking about the unemployment rate, and we're all trying to get an idea, because the problem we face, is that most of the data that's released, the employment report, for example, that just came out for the states, that was on the 17th of April, that goes back really to the 2nd and 3rd week of March. So that does not really give you a gauge of what's going on in the Nebraska economy. So what was the data that we primarily used? And that the study we produced first was a first cut, and we're calling this one the second cut. This is the latest study, and then we'll have a third cut. Now, why are we doing first cut, second cut, and third cut? Is because we're getting better and better data. Now, the primary source of data for this, the previous estimate and for this estimate, is first-time claims for unemployment insurance that comes out every Thursday. And of course, that came out this morning, and I looked at the data already, and it seems to validate what we're assuming in our study. And I say, just broadly speaking, right now, and we'll get it, we're not going to get into this, but the unemployment rate for Nebraska right now, in my estimates, and Scott, if you can back me up here, or actually maybe refute me, is we're about, unemployment rate for Nebraska is probably 14 to 15 to 16%, but we're not going to know that until probably into May. May the 22nd. We'll get a better bead on what the Nebraska unemployment rate was or is for April. So that's the primary basis for our estimates, is the first time claims for unemployment insurance, again, which comes out every Thursday, and that's the best source. Now, we'll come up later on, as I said, in 2000, later on, that would be May the 22nd, and we'll actually use the employment report and which will come out with also the unemployment rate. Scott, would you say a few words if you would?
Sure, certainly. We use the unemployment claims because that's as close as we've got to real-time indicators. We don't have to worry about a lag. Sometimes on the employment data, frankly, you're going to be a month, 2 months behind, with the notion that even within 6 months, you're going to have a complete revision of that data. So we feel pretty comfortable with using the unemployment claims data. We then tried to spread out the unemployment claims across industries as we were able to estimate in terms of the overall impact. Right,
and you can see here, we've brought up Sarah and Adam have brought up the first-time claims. Now this is only first-time claims, and these do not include those who continue to draw unemployment insurance, and also does not include those individuals that either didn't qualify for unemployment insurance, didn't file for unemployment insurance, or are moved out of the labor force. So that you see here, if you notice, in Nebraska, it really didn't kick in until the third week of March there. You see on the March 21st, you see Nebraska there in beautiful Creighton blue. Sorry for that, I just had to do that. 1.49%, and I guess I could say in beautiful Nebraska red there, although it's a US number, it's 1.8%. And notice as time goes on, in the next week, you see there it's widened. The US rate is 3.7%. Now this is first-time claims. That does not include those who continue to draw unemployment insurance, nor does it include those who do not qualify or did not file for unemployment insurance or for some other reason aren't there. And you see the gap has widened. If you look at the latest number, and the number, by the way, we don't show it here because obviously it just came out this morning. The latest first-time claims for unemployment insurance for Nebraska moved from about 16,000 to 12,000. Now that's what we expect. The problem is the continuing claims is growing as we move along, and we're using those continuing claims, not the first-time claims, to measure the economic impacts. And Scott can tell you a little bit more about how we did that, or how, in this case, Scott, we worked together on this and we talked about it. How can we get a handle on this? Because, and I would argue it's a pretty good handle on what's going on in Nebraska. And as Scott said, we distributed these individuals that are unemployed in Nebraska across the industries most affected, and that would be, of course, hospitality, leisure and hospitality would be one of the major industries, professional and business services as well. But Scott can address that issue more correctly and better than I can.
Well, in the professional business services, what we saw was job losses in travel services, business support services, not just at the national level, but we've witnessed it also here in Omaha. Most surprisingly, when you put all this information into the model that we use, the in-plan system, one of the top industries impacted are actually at the offices of dentists, physicians, and related healthcare practitioners. And we've seen that across the state as workers in that industry are furloughed.
Yeah, and what you want me to say a word or two here?
Well, actually, Ernie and Scott, we just got a question in, if you don't mind me interjecting this.
Oh, sure, of course.
Can initial unemployment claims include people who are still working but have reduced hours or income? Meaning, can you be a part-time employee that's filing an initial unemployment claim, or are all of those claims people who are entirely unemployed?
And now Scott, I think, back me up here. You have to be fully unemployed. You can't be working part-time. Now, I believe that's the case. And is that correct, Scott?
Yes, that's correct. Someone that's unemployed part-time for economic reasons would be counted in the overall counted as overall marginally attached to the labor force. But in terms of the initial unemployment claims, they're not going to be counted.
Right. And I think that's an important point. We're sort of measuring, we're not really catching underemployment, what some think of it as underemployment, those who were working full-time who are now working part-time. That's an important point there, and thanks for that question, because that's very important. We're not going to capture that. And let me just say, I'm going to get a little political here. I mean, the recently passed CARES Act, it's just there, and there's several senators that voted against portions of that, which gives the unemployed individual $600 plus his or her unemployment insurance. Now, you don't have to be an economist to figure out if you make more for being unemployed than you do for being employed, the incentive is to remain unemployed or to leave that work, that employer. And that's one of the real problems going forward. And I'm obviously concerned about that. We had senators, our own senator, Nebraska Senator Sass. We had Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, Senator Scott from South Carolina, and Senator Scott from Florida voted against that portion of the bill. And I have to say, if I'd been a senator there, I would have voted against it as well. We are now incentivizing unemployment, and we're incentivizing individuals to move off of not going back to work, and that's a real problem. So, but I guess one of the things we're talking about is this, and Scott can talk about this more effectively than I can. We're talking about the number of workers that are unemployed that left employment, and we're measuring the impact of those workers, and we placed it into the implant multiplier system. Now, don't pardon the analogy here, but like a meat grinder, I guess. You put it in it. You put the meat in at the top, and the ground beef comes out below. Well, in this case, the ground beef below is the economic impacts. So we put the numbers in there. We estimated, and Scott and I talked a lot about this. And again, the primary basis for our numbers is the not first-time claims, but continuing claims for unemployment insurance, but also using the first-time claims as sort of a backup.
We've got a few more questions. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Scott.
Well, what I was going to mention is on the continuing claims, something that we need to be mindful of is even those continuing claims, those are people who are unemployed and in a state program. They're in a covered industry, which is important, and they have made the claim and they're part of the system. There's another cohort of people who are unemployed that aren't part of a state program.
Yeah, right. That's very important. We had to estimate that as well. In other words, if you would, Scott, tell the viewers how we estimated that portion that aren't included in the continuing claims for unemployment insurance. How do, if you would, Scott?
Well, the Department of Labor captures what's called a recipiency rate, which tries to measure the number of people that are uninsured relative to the overall number of people that are unemployed. And our experience during the last recession was that during the peak unemployment period here in Nebraska, we averaged a recipiency rate of about 40%, 40.3%. We applied that 40.3% to the continuing claims to achieve an estimate of a broader number of people that are unemployed in the state of Nebraska.
Okay. Right, and I think, Sarah, you were bringing Adam there, you're bringing up our results there from our impact.
And well, we've got a few questions back on unemployment, so I'll hit those, and then if that's okay. Is there a method to track the breakdown of unemployment by region in the state?
I don't think that, Scott, you can answer this. No, I don't think on a timely basis you can. You can use some data from census, but that's only available on an annual basis, and it's a spring survey. And that's but as far as timely data, we'll be able to get it not from the unemployment claims, but down the road we'll be able to get it on a county level basis.
But also on May the 22nd, that's the next release of state and local unemployment. On May 22nd, we'll be able to get the unemployment rate. Now, it's not the insured or uninsured, it's the unemployment rate for the metro or the urban areas in Nebraska, which would, of course, be Nebraska, Lincoln, and Grand Island. I don't think South Sioux City is included in there. So those three areas, those three called metro areas, will have the unemployment rate, but that's not the that's the overall unemployment rate. That's not the what we're talking about here, which is the continuing claims for unemployment insurance.
This is one of those classic cases in economics where there's a trade-off. We're looking at the timeliness of the data and trying to incorporate that into the model, and it's may not be complete, but we're trying to make estimates to work around that, again with the emphasis on the timeliness. Or you can get more complete data, but that comes with considerable lag.
We had another question. Do you have, what was the total unemployment March 1st in Nebraska, and then what is it today?
Now, I just came up with my estimate, right? And this is back of the envelope. We didn't estimate that, but we're probably, and when we're talking about in Nebraska, we're probably at 3.5% March 1st. We're probably now at 14 to 15%. Now that's, again, we're moving to unemployment. That's total unemployment, not the continuing claims. And that's an important distinction. And even my students in my classes, sometimes I ask that question, do you have to be on unemployment insurance to be counted as unemployed? No, you do not. And in fact, as Scott said, to get the unemployed, the number of unemployed in Nebraska, you divide, now we're dividing by, what was it, Scott,
About 40.3%.
Yeah. So so the number of unemployed, and compare that to historically in Nebraska, we're at probably we're about 4 times the number of unemployed in Nebraska today than the highest level ever. We're probably at about 3 to 4 times the highest unemployment rate ever hit in Nebraska. That would be back in the 2008-9 recession. That'd be back to the 1991 recession. That'd be back to the early 80s recession, and then the 70s recession. You take the highest rate Nebraska achieved during any of those periods of recessions, and we're now at about 3 to 4 times that rate. So this is unprecedented. And so, and when we do a third cut, and I guess Sarah and Adam will talk about that, we're going to do another estimate later on as data come in and we get better and better data, we can come up with more refined estimates. But we're pretty comfortable with these estimates we're going to present today, because the impacts, and that's the problem, the impacts are growing. They're not receding. They're growing every day as we conduct this webinar today.
We have a couple of questions related to how much these numbers take into account the self-employed, gig economy workers. Can you speak to that? Are we seeing that in this picture yet?
Scott?
Well, the figures do include a category for self-employed proprietor income. Whether I can categorize that as gig economy, that's outside, that's not one of the categories that's captured, but the self-employed income is captured in this.
And when you're self-employed, you file you do file and pay self-employment unemployment insurance. So you do qualify as a gig worker in some, if you paid that, and most people do pay it. So you do qualify for that, and I believe, and they would be counted. We do count it. Now, it's like with most economics, you're talking about with margins of error, and we're not 100% certain. These numbers are presented with a confidence interval, what we call it, a confidence interval, and we have to take that into account, understanding that there is some error in there.
I've got 2 more unemployment related questions, then we're going to move on to economic impacts, if you guys are okay with that.
Okay.
Sure.
Another question was, have you heard of any employers that have been under pressure by their employees to forego the Payer Protection Act loans so that employees can file for unemployment and make more? And I think this gets to what you were saying, Ernie, earlier when you said you went a little political on us.
Right. And we do here at Creighton University, separate from Goss and Associates, we do 2 surveys a month, okay? One of manufacturers and one of bank CEOs. And we ask the questions to bank CEOs. That would be in Nebraska and 9 other states. We ask it last, let's see, it would be April survey just completed. And the bankers they were pretty positive about the PPP, triple P program, saying it went well in Nebraska. And I would say it did go well. And they didn't report any of it. Many of the bankers reported good experience with that program. No reports of that, but you got to think. I mean, if you put an incentive, if there's anything that puts all economists in one barrel, if you can imagine that, all economists in one barrel. That's a good start, I guess they call that. You put it. We believe in incentives. You know, it's the carrot and the stick. And if you incentivize unemployment, if you incentivize leaving the workforce, or not leaving the workforce, leaving the job, you will get more of that. And I would argue, Sarah, that that's definitely happening. It is definitely happening out there. Now, the extent of it, we don't know. I'll ask that question. I should have asked it in our manufacturing survey this month. I didn't. I will ask it in our banking survey next month. Are we seeing that? That's a very good question, though.
And then our last unemployment question for right now, which is kind of a combo question. When will we know the extent for how many of these job losses are permanent or long-term? And then how high or how long can this unemployment rate be sustainable? Is that the trigger between recession and depression, or are there other measurements other than employment for looking at that?
Scott, you want to?
Well, honestly, those are good questions, and they are related to each other. To get at what would be classified as long-term unemployment, it is going to take time. We're going to look at that cohort of people that are unemployed for 27 weeks or longer, and that's going to take several months to reach that point. There is not a real-time indicator that's going to point to those type of changes. We have layoff data that comes out from various services at the beginning of each month, which might be used as a proxy, but that's going to be speak to very specific industries. As far as a hard number that's going to support any claims about permanent or long-time jobs, again, it's going to take several months.
Yeah, I just did a survey or discussion with CEO Magazine. The author, the writer, called me and asked a number of economists nationwide, what's going to be the shape of the recovery? And I started out, I went from a V early on. I was on a radio station here in Omaha, KFAB, and I think Gary Saddlemeyer, maybe he's out there right now, he asked me, what's the shape of the recovery? And I said, V. Okay, and meaning a sharp downturn and a sharp upturn. That's what I believed at that time. I expected that. Then I changed to, no, it's not going to be, it's going to be a U. And now I'm not even certain on a U. In other words, this is more, I'm moving toward a check mark, a sharp downturn and a moderate upturn. So when will we get back to pre-employment levels? Not this year. I just don't expect it. The last recession was 18 months in length. That's 2008 to 2009. This recession, and if we can call it a recession, economists, we don't have a sharp distinction between a recession and a depression. I guess some people say, well, a recession's when your neighbor's out of work, and a depression's when you're out of work. So yeah, we're going to see, this is going to be a sharp downturn, and I'm really concerned. I mean, we'll have to address and this is separate from what our study did, of the federal government and the Federal Reserve's in unprecedented stimulus packages. And who pays for that? Well, you can probably tell those who are viewing in that I'm not a millennial. I'm a baby boomer, and it's probably not me that's going to pay for all this stimulus, that's going to pay for the Federal Reserve's stimulus. It's going to be somewhere, but that's apart from this study that we've just done. Long answer to a short question.
Well, thank you guys for that. And then I know our viewers want to continue on. And so here's the meat of your report. Do you guys mind talking about this estimated economic impact here that we found?
Scott, you're the guy that put it into the again, the implant multiplier system. We have a license for that in the state of Nebraska and Iowa for that matter. So Scott, you want to talk about those numbers?
Sure. After we went through some of the preliminary discussions and estimates of trying to get at a number of unemployed folks in Nebraska, especially after the, going back to what Ernie said earlier, the reference period or the reference week for the March release that's already come out is the 12th of the month. Well, as we've seen in a previous slide, we really didn't start to see the impact in Nebraska until after that reference week. So to try to get at an estimate of the unemployed and then the impact on the state of Nebraska, we had to use the continuing claims. We're using, again, the recipiency rate to get at an overall number. Take those jobs, now these are the jobs that were lost, and we consider them direct impacts. Put the direct impacts into our in-plan model, and the results are what you see on this slide. We estimate almost 100,000 jobs being impacted, either lost jobs or significantly reduced hours. Wage and salary impact, now this is on a monthly basis, about $257 million. And you were speaking before about the self-employment income, you're looking at a hit of about $30 million.
And this is just through April the 4th.
Right, this is basically over, well, even a little less than a month's impact. The total impact on sales activity in Nebraska output, $834 million is what we're looking at. Now, this does not include any of the flow of funds that are starting to come in from the federal government, the CARES Act, the Paycheck Protection Plan, and the most recent one that I saw, the $19 billion in farm relief.
All right. And this, in terms of this number, how does it measure up to GDP? It's somewhat larger than GDP. Because there is some double counting in there. And the 96,000, these impacts include not just the direct, but the spillovers. In other words, the impact in the hotel industry, hospitality industry, as it spills over into other industries like real estate. There are impacts already in real estate. I mean, individuals, and we will see those impacts continue. And these impacts, again, I don't mean to be on the negative side, but I don't know how I can be otherwise. These impacts are going to grow. As I said, the numbers that came out this morning showed that Nebraska's first-time claims went up by 12,000, a little more than 12,000. The continuing claims, that's those who are still on unemployment, plus the first-time claims is up also. So we're talking about first-time claims. I think that was about 70,000, I believe it was.
Well, for the continuing claims, it was about 70,000.
70,000, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there was, Sarah, wasn't there a question, or Adam, another question I saw came in?
Yeah, the question just came up. How do you see the rural or agricultural economy specifically being impacted?
Wow, that's, I mean, it is, I'd say it's getting more and more because the transportation industry getting hit, exports. Of course, I don't mean to get off the topic, but we did, in January, we did our survey of bank CEOs in rural areas of 10 states. There's an excitement, if you can call it excitement. Yeah, I think we can. We got USMCA, this trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, that was signed. Then we had the phase 1 of China, a trade agreement. Then we thought 2020 was going to look very much better for farming. Not so right now. We're seeing the ag sector being hit significantly. Look at beef prices. Look at pork prices. We're talking about, and as reported in the Omaha World Herald this morning, farmers that are what would you call, euthanizing their hogs instead of selling them. I mean, we're talking about unprecedented times. Now that has happened before, but nonetheless, we're talking about a time when oil prices went to a negative $14 a barrel. Now, obviously, that's, I believe, it is unprecedented. And we're talking about pork, beef, all these prices to the farmer now, to the farmer. Now to the consumer, that's not the case. And so the farmer out there is facing very tough times, and our numbers will begin reflecting that. Now I would argue, and Scott would be a better person to talk about this, but I would argue it's going to take some time to pick up the impacts in agriculture as we move down the road. But again, that's why we title this first cut, second cut, and then third cut. Now, who's to say we don't have a fourth cut, but we'll have to wait and see on that one. Scott, do you want to talk about impacts in agriculture?
Well, yeah, from the in-plan model, what we're looking at is going to be the impact on the demand side. And then on an annualized basis, just what we have so far, you're probably looking at about a $175 million to $200 million impact. Again, that's just on the demand side. What's going to be interesting to see is this new relief package that's coming in on top of what's already been out there. I don't know what kind of regulatory hoops people are going to have to jump through, but some of the direct support to farmers, and then the USDA purchases and distributions, partnering with food banks and the such, that should have some mitigating impact on the downside. But still, when you're looking at live cattle futures down 25% and hogs down 25% since March 4th, that's a huge impact. And again, we'll see that start to grow in the models.
Right, and it is important. Scott brought up an important point there. The spending, the support, the subsidies, the bailout, whatever you wish to call it from the federal government, the Fed, we're not capturing a lot of that right now. In other words, that's again why we need to, I would argue, need to do more of these studies and do we're doing a third cut, of course, and we'll have to wait and see and how that captures as you say, Scott, it's a demand issue on the ag side. We're not going to see those impacts. Those will take some time to work through the system, because in a lot of cases, we even call it non-farm employment, and it doesn't include farm employment and doesn't include some of the pain. But back to that point, in our Creighton survey of bank CEOs in rural areas, our index dropped to, it ranges between 0 and 100. It was around a 12. 0 to 100, 12, don't need an economist to tell you that's not good. We're talking about unprecedented times, but that's not, and to be on the positive, be a little more positive, the support from the federal government and the Federal Reserve is going to have, we'll see some of those numbers mitigated or reduced in the weeks and months ahead as well.
Yeah,
well, go ahead,
I'm sorry, Sarah. I think you're starting to see some of the uncertainty clearer. And the uncertainty, it isn't the risk of the downside. We all knew this was going to happen. It was the uncertainty that was stymieing the economy moving forward. And as each day passes, we have a little bit of that removed as we go forward.
Right.
Well, talking about our economy, we've had some questions on how does this translate to revenue loss for the state? And so we have that slide up here now where you can see that. And then you talked about the CARES Act. Do you know if that money, I mean, I do, but I'll see what you guys think about this, that money on, if the CARES Act money can go directly to fill these holes that we're seeing on tax revenues?
Yes, it can, and it will. In fact, there are members of Congress that wanted to add on to the current addition to the payroll protection plan. I don't agree with that. Support to state and local governments. And unfortunately, as noted, some of that money is going awry, meaning going to some universities that I could certainly support that. No, I don't support that. But nonetheless, yes, it will mitigate some of that. But but think about in Omaha, in some of the Henry Doorly Zoo, the revenues from the Henry Doorly Zoo. Think about the College World Series. Think about the Berkshire Hathaway meeting. Think about the Olympic trials that were in June. All those were significant local and state tax collection revenues. And each of those probably, now I don't have the numbers, but I would think each of those is probably $8 million in state and local taxes, 8 to 9 million. Now, the Henry Doorly Zoo, the number, certainly in the top 3 tourist attractions in Nebraska, a lot of state and local tax collections resulting there. So, Scott, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's with the event closures. That's the real impact on the state and local is going to happen when we start seeing the receipt numbers come in for June, July, August, for the May, June, July period. That's when we're really going to see the hit. Right now, we do have a hit, and if annualized, would amount to about 6 to 8% of general revenues, as based on the last press release that I saw from the state budget division.
Yeah.
So I mean, there is an impact. What we presented here is on a monthly basis.
Yeah, right.
But if this impact persists or grows and accumulates, and again, we're going to have those add-ons from the missing out on the College World Series, missing out on different types of concert events that would have occurred, that typically occur in the summer.
Right.
Then yeah, we're gonna see this is going to multiply over time, grow over time.
Well, Scott,
that impact. Oh, go ahead.
He's
Ernie.
on his gloom. I'm doomed. So I'm sorry about all this negativism, but and I don't. This is nothing. I know that was a sort of one of my funnies, but it's not funny, of course. This is deadly serious, and back to the. And we're not going to talk about getting back to work. That's a more of a medical decision, and my medical expertise doesn't go beyond putting a Band-Aid on. So you know, this is very, very, very big issue. And I've been in this business since 1983 as an economist. Nothing like this. People say, has anything like this happened in your career? Heck no, not in my career, not in Adam Smith, not even in Adam Smith's career, not even in Milton Friedman or John Maynard Keynes. Well, Maynard Keynes gets close. He wrote his General Theory in 1936. It was published in 1936, of course, the middle of the Depression. Sorry,
Ernie, Scott, if these numbers continue to multiply, we have a viewer question. The state, of course, has to have a balanced budget. Local communities have to provide services. What's most realistic for them if these numbers do continue to multiply? Is it reducing expenses? Is it increasing income? We have a viewer who says, they're on a fixed retirement income. This could have implications for property taxes.
Yes.
What do you think the implications are for what should happen with tax structure and tax policy in the months and years ahead?
We're going to have a tightening of the belt, and that's got to happen. And it means, in other words, the idea that some of us can escape. I guess I'm not supposed to do that, but I did. Escape. It's all from the most recently born Nebraskan to the oldest Nebraskan. We're all going to share in this. We're all going to have to do it. And state and local government is going to have to tighten the belt, whether that's in state and local spending for education. Unfortunately, that's going to have to happen. And one of the things everyone knows, you can't sell out tomorrow for today. So we have to be more judicious in our investments. Now, that's very high-minded of me to say that, but we do have to do some cutting in state and local spendings. They cannot continue. We, unfortunately, and I hate to say it, we may see a tax increase resulting from this. And of course, Nebraska is already a high tax state, and people deny that, but it is. Nebraska is the highest, and local spending has been in Nebraska has been growing at an unsustainable pace. Just to say that right out. In other words, local spending, now not so much state spending, had been growing at an unsustainable pace, and now the burden. I think if in those cases, now's the time. I don't really want to say this, but interest rates are at record low levels. If you can borrow. And it's a time for a bond issues. You're going to get some, and I don't like to encourage that. It results in overspending, but now is the time to take advantage of these very low interest rates. And we're talking about interest rates that are, in terms of, say, the 10-year Treasury, U.S. Treasury, it's now at about 60 basis points. That's 0.6%. Historically, that had been between 3 and 4%. 3% lower. I mean, we're talking about record low. So now's the time to issue bonds instead of, well, it will result, that does result in higher taxes as well. Scott, do you want to?
Well,
One question people have, sorry, go ahead, Scott.
Well, what I was going to say was the one thing that you can draw encouragement at this time is that we do have a federal government that's pushing down to the state level the response to different elements of the crisis. That's encouraging. The other thing that's encouraging is we're not necessarily going to have the dead hand of regulation stymieing any recovery from this. If anything, we're seeing regulations reduced, which opens up the case for much stronger growth going forward.
Yeah. And that's probably different from the last recession when we actually had the opposite with Dodd-Frank and other heavy hand of regulation. So in this case, we are probably going to see less regulation. So that's a positive, again, from a person who believes in freer markets rather than less free markets.
A number of viewers are asking whether, if the state were needing to look for a way, and local governments too, to pay for services, whether expanding the sales tax base is a way to do it. Is that tenable in this environment, though, where sales tax has taken such a big hit?
Well, it's the only place that Nebraska is somewhat competitive, is in sales taxes. But that said, this is no environment to be raising taxes. What I would argue for are fees. Now, there's a heck of a lot of resistance to fees. You're going to have to raise, for example, now there's maybe not as much money there, but we're going to have to raise the fees for going to, for example, the parks and recreation. We're going to have to raise some of the fees, and Nebraska can't ill afford raising the fees on license plates, but the fees, and that's one place where you have some money. But in terms of competitiveness, Nebraska is more competitive on sales taxes than any other taxes. So there is some room there, but not in this environment. I think we're going to have to see more belt tightening than we see tax increases. Has to be.
So
thank you.
Oh, go ahead.
Sarah, we've got a couple questions on property taxes. Do you want to field those?
Yeah, so that's where I was going to get to. Actually, so talking about how the CARES Act money can fill some of these holes, we see that property taxes are a main funding source for local governments. But guidance from the Treasury is actually saying that funds may not be used from the CARES Act to fill shortfalls, in government revenue or to cover expenditures that would not otherwise qualify under the statute. So essentially revenue replacement is not permissible. Can you guys just talk about the property tax impact that you're seeing here? And I'll share the screen again, and how that's made up, and how do you see that going forward, since that is our major revenue source for local governments and schools?
Well, I'll just say money is fungible. Money is fungible, meaning you may say you can't do that, but you will do it. There are ways of substituting and doing that. So it will be done. Scott, do you want to chime in there? I will say more about property taxes once Scott's finished there.
Well, I think the gist of putting the money into the private sector's hands rather than keeping it in the government sector will benefit the economy in the long run.
Right. If you look at property taxes, and one says, well, every state has a property tax problem, not like Nebraska has. If you compare Kansas, for example, and everybody says, well, you're talking about New Jersey. No, I'm talking about Kansas, or I should say, in terms of lower taxes, you're talking about Colorado. Well, no, how about looking at Kansas? If you take the property taxes per bushel of corn in Nebraska versus a bushel of corn in Kansas, I think the bushel of corn is much the same, but the taxes are not the same. You're probably talking about 3 times the rate. The tax rate, ultimate property tax rate on that bushel of corn for the Kansas producer. So that's a real problem, and it has to be addressed. But how do you address it in this situation? In other words, schools are going to be hard pressed for funds. Now, let's talk about some of the policies that come out of this. We're talking about now us, universities, educators, delivering more effectively through telecommunications, through digital, through virtual classes. That's going to be a positive. In other words, we're going to have to, we in the universities are going to have to cut our costs, going to have to deliver more effectively, and that's at Creighton's level, at private universities, that's public universities, that's K through 12. We're going to have to see that done. We cannot continue in Nebraska to spend the way we have, and that again, that's it. I'm not just talking about the public universities and public schools. I'm talking about private as well. This is going to take, I mean, doing this webinar, I'll bet you 6 months ago, we couldn't have probably done it this effectively. And I thank you at Platt for doing this. So there's some real positives coming out of this. We're going to have government services being delivered more effectively through offering digital access, providing, for example, license plates, license this through the internet, through that, and we're already doing some of that, of course. So there's some real positives coming out of this. So, but government has got to look at that and got to examine ways of delivering services more effectively at a more efficient on lower price.
Can you guys talk about the $17.6 million loss in property tax revenue that we've that you forecasted here? And I can share that screen again if you need me to.
Yeah, that's based on primarily on decreased valuations. What we see happening across the country is valuations being impacted. There was a county in Indiana that I think is suspended for a period of time. I don't remember how many months, any type of property tax collections because of the realization that folks will be hard pressed to pay. But the notion here is that with the reduced economic activity spilling over into property valuations, that ultimately that will be picked up in terms of property tax collections being reduced.
That's true. And to some, so it's, and the question I'm sure the viewers is asking is, well, will that really come about? In other words, maybe the assessments will not be reduced, will not catch up to market values, market estimates. But there's also the new activity. There is some of that. Would that be correct, Scott? That some of that is new activity, reduced that there's some buildings that aren't built. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so the idea that we're just going to hold the assessments constant. Well, how can you hold the assessments constant when the valuations, the real valuations, the market value is going down, and they will be going down, particularly, again, in agriculture. To address the earlier question, farmland prices have held up much better than farm income. Well, this is going to dig another, I won't say a hole, but it's going to push down farmland valuations and assessments lower. So we should see that play out in the weeks and, well, not weeks, in the months and years ahead.
Thank you, Ernie. We have another viewer question here. We've talked a little bit about the impact on ag producers, ag land. Let's talk briefly about ag labor, food processing labor. What do you anticipate will be the economic impact of COVID-19 on? We have a hot spot right now in our meat packing facilities. A lot of the labor that is dependent on that. We have a lot of immigrant labor and as well undocumented immigrant labor, and we have a population that is in the thick of this. Not all of them are eligible for benefits related to it. So what is the long-term ramifications here on the immigration topic?
Scott, you want to? I'll jump in.
Go ahead.
The impacts are growing and will continue to grow, and the impacts on food processing, for example, the question, those impacts are growing. And there is this idea among some, again, I'm getting too political here, that somehow we can, there was a Harvard study that said, well, we're going to have to shelter in place until 2022. Now, what academic could say something that stupid? The idea that we can be shelter in place till 2022, we're going to have to begin opening up, and there will be, unfortunately, new infections. There will be deaths. But if we shelter in place till 2022, I'm not sure who will be on this webinar. Most of us will be hunkering down, growing food in our backyard. This is crazy to think that we've got, I mean, the impacts are just significant. They're growing. And this is Nebraska's impacts, which are smaller than impacts in some of the other states. And
Yeah,
so
you know, you've got to put this into perspective. When you look at the counties that represent the 5 boroughs of New York, you're looking at, on average, 118 deaths per 100,000 population. Do you know what the Omaha Metro, including the Iowa and Nebraska side, is on a per 100,000 basis? 0.9.
Yeah. So to some degree, we are paying the price for what's going on in New York. Now, that's not to say that some of these impacts won't grow. Well, they will grow. They are growing. Nebraska is to some degree catching up, but not as you point out, Scott. And by the way, if you look at the rate, even with New York included, the rate per million individuals, the infection rate and the death rate of the U.S. is lower than almost every nation in Europe. Almost every nation in Europe. In other words, if you ranked us among the developed nations, that's the U.S., among the developed nations in the world, we're probably 8th or 9th. But always we talk about the gross number. Well, obviously we're going to have more infections in the U.S. than you have in Germany, or Sweden, or Canada. China, not true. But anyway, that the infection rates will grow, and we're going to have to move toward opening the economy back up. Now, back to the question of meat packing or food processing. I've been in those plants, and we may have to they may have to reorganize their work environment. I just don't know. I don't know enough about that to comment on it. I just don't know.
Well, I know we want to continue. We've got 2 more slides here I want to share with everybody so that we can finish talking about the meat of the report. This is the change in unemployment claims, talking about non-shelter-in-place states versus shelter-in-place states. And I can jump between these 2 slides. Do you guys mind talking about this?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, and if you flip the next slide, Sarah, you'll see that it's a lot lower. Shelter-in-place states have a much higher rate, but we in economics, we say this all the time, and everybody, there's a different causal. Is there causation? Does not, our correlation does not mean causation. In other words, those that had the higher rates of first-time claims for unemployment insurance, they adopted shelter in place. So it's not necessarily that being shelter in place state produced these higher rates of unemployment, but they are higher rates of the covered employment, the unemployment claims as a percent of covered employment. Now again, what is the change in unemployment claims, and this is the change, and covered employment. What's covered employment? These are, that's employment that's covered by unemployment insurance, and what would be exempt from that? Agriculture is not included in there, and some other. I think the railroad, is that right, Scott? The railroad, is the railroad included in there?
I believe that's treated separately. Yes.
Okay, so yeah, that's in other words, it's a little overstating it, but I thought we should put it in there just to let people know that at least to some degree, one could argue. I would not be one of those who would argue that being a shelter-in-place state causes your covered unemployment rate unemployment insurance covered employment rate to go up. But it doesn't indicate it by being a non-shelter-in-place state causes your unemployment rate to go up. In other words, the infection rates. That doesn't make sense, I'll tell you. Even to me, I just said it. I hope you know what I just said. Gosh, oh boy.
Well, we've got about 5 more minutes left, and I've got a couple questions that have come in asking about bank debt. So asking about, will there be bank closings since banks' assets are comprised, with a high percentage of loans and they don't have a lot of capital? How does that impact? So can you talk about bank debt and the impact this is having?
You know, and we benefit here. I would like to argue, we do a monthly survey of bank CEOs, and I've talked about it a number of times here. And we ask, and 30% of the bankers reported that their delinquency rates were up, 30%. So delinquency rates were up. We were already seeing the farm debt, that's on farmland, for example, up. And there was the big concern among bankers is the foreclosure rate. Now so we are seeing debt levels rising, but on the flip side, farmers have been much more judicious about borrowing. They came into this in a better position than, say, in the 80s. We're talking about banks that are in pretty good position. So I would argue with the federal support that we're seeing, now that's again separate from our report, the federal support there, what we're seeing from the Federal Reserve providing liquidity, I think the banks are going to be in pretty good shape going out there. The problem they have is, of course, the interest rates on the loans that they're making are not good. They're low. But overall, I would argue that the banks are going to go through this in pretty good shape.
Okay, and then I want to respect everybody's time. We've got about 2 to 3 minutes before the top of the hour, so I'm going to have this as our last question. Where do you two gentlemen see there being opportunities for Nebraskans in this particular crisis? And are there any proactive steps that Nebraskans can take to better themselves coming out of this pandemic on the other side?
One of the things that I look at as an opportunity for Nebraska, and this plays on some of the existing veterinary medicines that we have, is to aggressively pursue pharmaceutical opportunities and bring them back from overseas.
I would argue also, I do some consulting work for a fine Nebraska company. I'll give them a shout out here, Hamilton Telecommunications in Aurora, Nebraska. There's an example of a company that's providing telephone services for the hearing impaired across the U.S. We in Nebraska, I think, have some real positive, some industries where we can have some real positive impacts, particularly as it relates to telecommunications. We have a workforce that's very solid, well educated. We've got telecommunication services that are good. We've got a good backbone in terms of the, again, telecommunications. So I would argue that we can, and we have a state and local governments that are more responsive to our citizens. And I would argue that we can outcompete other states, other areas in the nation in that regard. In other words, providing professional business services, for example, an area where we can do it better and cheaper. Our costs are lower. Now, property taxes aside and some others, we are competitive in overall cost, and that would be real estate, for example, and other costs. So that can be communicated via, again, by telecommunications, offering services, whether you're talking about business and technical services, engineering services, all those services, educational services. We can provide that from good old Nebraska to good old New York at a better price than New York can provide it to New York.
Ernie, Scott, I want to thank you so much for all of your insights on today's program. We're looking forward to continuing with this series. I want to share with everyone that we're going to continue to have updates on the economic impact of COVID-19 on the Nebraska economy. You can find all the latest releases at plattinstitute.org/policy, which is where you can find our work. Also, if you want to stay updated with the Platt Institute, join our weekly email. Jim Vocal sends out a great message. We're actually sending probably about 2 a week, as there's so much information out there. You can subscribe to that at plattinstitute.org/subscribe. Also, check out our blog at thefullplatter.com. We have had we're so grateful for the response that you have all participated in these webinars. We want to make sure that we're providing timely and useful information for all Nebraskans so that we can see this through safely together, and not only make sure we reduce the pain of this crisis, but maximize the opportunity for growth on the other side. And so we'd encourage you to join us in 2 weeks. We're going to get the registration page up today for our next Platt Institute webinar. We're going to have Catherine Lawhead, Senior Policy Analyst from the Tax Foundation, to discuss the CARES Act and taxes. That's, of course, the federal relief plan. How does it impact state and local governments? Join us again Wednesday, May 6th at 11 a.m., 10 Mountain, and we'll be here with you for our next discussion. I want to thank everybody for their great questions, and we'll look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Sarah.
guys.
Thank you, sir.
Sarah.
Thank you.